Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast, episode number 161. Just under a month ago, I saw a graphic from the Scottish Independence Convention, and I looked through the list of names of the organisations and members, people involved in it, and I noticed that I'd had basically every single person there on the show, except for Elaine C. Smith, NHS for Yes, Christians for Indy, Yes Pensioners, and AyeScotland. And then I tweeted immediately, okay, here's the people I've not had on the podcast. Anyone want to come on? And basically, they've all got in touch. And the first one I managed to get the interview done with was Christians for Indy. I'm not a religious man myself. In fact, if I'm describing myself as not religious, that's something of an understatement. However, as today's interviewee points out in the conversation, around 400,000 people in Scotland are regular churchgoers. Is that really a demographic that the Yes movement can afford to ignore? The convener of Christians for Indy is ex-MSP Dave Thompson. Dave has been an SNP member for a long time and knows some interesting things about the history of the party as well, which he included in the interview. Here's the interview with Dave, and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. Hi Dave, how's it going?
It's going well, Michael. Yourself?
Yeah, very good. It's good to be back podcasting. Had a wee break, but now I've had 5 out in the last 3 weeks or something, so back at it and busy. But I asked you on because I found a little thing, a little graphic talking about all the people involved in the Indy convention, and yours was one of the groups that I've not managed to speak to. I've managed to speak to almost everyone involved in the Indy convention on the show, so I'm very, very happy you've agreed to come on.
Very happy to be on, and we're happy to speak to anyone at any time.
So can I just ask, what was the origins of the group Christians for Indy? Why was it felt necessary to set up the group?
Well, the group actually was first got together back in 2009, which is 8 years ago, before any talk of an Indy referendum or anything like that. So we predate, I think, most of the other Indy groups other than maybe the likes of the SNP and itself and so on. And it was really a group of us who would meet at the conference quite often on a Sunday morning, where we would head out and go to a church service rather than attend the conference event. So we formed, and we started off by holding a prayer service at the actual conference itself, so we wouldn't have to go elsewhere. And we did that for 3 years. We were all SNP members at the SNP conference. And then we started holding fringe events, and we've been holding fringe events at the SNP conferences, spring and the main conference, since 2012.
So it's been a long-running thing. And what I wanted to ask you, it's probably the most difficult question first, but are there any kind of specifically Christian reasons for supporting independence, or is the group an umbrella organisation of Christians who happen to support independence?
Well, we are an umbrella group because prior to the referendum itself, we relaunched ourselves back in February 2014 as a cross-party group. So you don't have to be a member of the SNP to be a member or a subscriber to the group. And we've got people like Ross Greer, who spoke at our fringe event at the recent SNP conference, who of course is a Green. I wouldn't claim that being a Christian gives me any particular right to demand independence, but what you will find in the Bible, that there's an awful lot of talk of nations. Right through the Bible it talks about nations. So that's the first thing. As a Christian, I believe in Jesus Christ, obviously, and in God, and I accept that a lot of people don't. But without, the Yes organisation, Scottish Independence, a broad range of people, and I think all views need to be listened to. So there's lots of talk of nations in the Bible. So if you accept that there are such things as nations, you then have to say to yourself, what defines a nation? And you then get down to talking about, I presume, characteristics, history, and boundaries. So the only difference between the UK, which isn't actually a nation, it's made up of a number of nations, and Scottish independence is that my argument would be that the Scottish nation is a nation, it exists, and that we should stand on our own 2 feet and make our own decisions, basically.
Yeah, talk of different kinds of nationalism. I was just wondering what you thought of this, because there's something that you said there that ties in with a wonderful tweet by David Halliday yesterday, saying the difference between the different kinds of nationalism, there's ethnic, civic, and Spanish, he thought, which I thought was quite funny. But ethnic nationalism was, you're not one of us. Civic nationalism is, you can be one of us if you want to, and that sort of reflects the Scottish independence movement, I think. And then Spanish nationalism, you're one of us even if you don't want to be. So I was wondering if you think that kind of ties in with your idea of the nation of Scotland as well.
Yeah, I mean, very much believe in the civic nationalism that the SNP, the Greens and others who believe in independence go along with. And I think the independence movement in Scotland has got a very long and proud history of developing the arguments through the ballot box and through debate and not going down the road of violence as many, independence and nationalist groups tend to do. So it's a very, very proud history that the Yes movement, the independence movement in Scotland has. And that chimes, I believe, very much with my Christian faith, to love your neighbour as you love yourself, and argue and debate and be inclusive. One of the big things that Christians would argue, I think, is that Jesus himself was a refugee, he was an asylum seeker when he went to Egypt. Why would we in Scotland or the UK or wherever ever turn away asylum seekers? One of the Gospels in Matthew, Jesus says, I was a stranger and you invited me in. And what he was referring to there was that not him personally, but if you do it for a stranger, you're doing it for Jesus. So that whole idea of being inclusive and loving your neighbour as you love yourself, I think is fundamental to the Christian faith and chimes very, very well with Scottish civic nationalism.
Yes, I'm not a religious man myself, but I do think it's important to, as you said, reflect the diversity and the breadth within the movement. So in the show, I've had the Greens, the SNP, the Radical Indy campaign. I've had lots of independent people. I've had people from Muslims for Indy and all of the group. Do you think that diversity is the strength of the movement, or do you believe that, let's just say there are some people within the SNP that think we should all just get in the SNP and just go for one group as a position of strength? Or do you think it's better to have that wide diversity in the movement?
I think the movement is much better for the broad base that it has and the wide diversity. If you go back 50, 60, 70 years ago, I suppose, the SNP at that time in the 60s, which is when I joined, by the way, I joined the SNP in 1965, over 52 years ago. But the SNP at that time wasn't a political party in the way that it's a political party now. It was the Yes movement of its day, if you like. And it was really the only political grouping of people who were promoting independence for Scotland. And then the SNP had to become a political party because it suffered from jibes that SNP stood still for still no policies. So the SNP went through the 70s developing policies on a whole range of issues, and I personally wrote the fishing policy at that time, which the party adopted. And it became a mainstream political party because we were told at that time the way to win independence isn't through covenants. And there was one in the 50s with 1 million signatures for Scottish independence. It was to win seats at Westminster. And if we won a majority of seats in Westminster, then we could get our independence. So the SNP turned into a political party, and it's now a very successful and powerful political party in Scotland, as you'll know, Michael. And it is going to be the main vehicle, I think, I don't think, I know, for us getting independence, because we need an SNP government supported probably by the Greens, who also support independence, and any other parties that support independence who can get elected to the Scottish Parliament. We need them to put through the legislation and to run the referendum and all the rest of it. But I think things have changed since 2014, and we need to have a much broader movement than just the SNP supported by other political parties. As well as being convener of Christians for Independence, I'm also the chairperson of Inver Yes 2, which is the Inverness Yes group. And we are very active, and we've now got a hub in Inverness, which you might be interested to learn, used to be the office of Danny Alexander MP, a Liberal Democrat. So I think the broad base is definitely advantageous for our movement, and I think we need to encourage yes groups all over the country.
It's very interesting what you're saying there about, the history of the movement at the beginning. Did you say that you wrote the fishing policy?
Yes, that's right.
Because fishing's a particularly thorny issue there. It's one of the things that surprises me. Why do so few fishermen support Scottish independence, in your opinion?
Well, can I say, first of all, before we carry on with the discussion, that Christians for Independence as a group, we don't tend to take a position on ethical issues and on particular policy issues, because Christians have a wide range of views in relation to all of these things. Mm-hmm. But as far as fishing is concerned, I think it's one of those things where I come from a place called Lossiemouth originally, although I now live in Inverness, and it had a huge fishing fleet when I was a young guy. And one of my first jobs, the age of about 13 or 14, was working in the fish sheds after school, heading and tailing prawns, a horrible, cold, damp job, but you earned a wee bit of money out of it. There are now no fishing boats in Lossiemouth, just yachts. There are still fishermen, but not that many, but the fish out of other ports. So the fishing industry suffered very badly because of the common fisheries policy and restrictions on fishing. And a lot of fishermen believe during the referendum and during the Brexit referendum too, that, the UK could maybe get fishing back, and that's why a lot of fishing people didn't vote, voted to come out of Europe, the EU, and also moved away from the SNP at the most recent general election. I think mistakenly so, and I think that the UK government will sell them down the river again as they negotiate with other countries for trade deals if we ever do come out of Europe. And I think the fishermen will not get a good deal at all. They would get a very good deal, I believe, with an independent Scotland. But there's a big debate to be had there about whether an independent Scotland, once we've been dragged out of the EU by the UK, should actually immediately go back into the EU, or whether a position like the Norway model, the EFTA and the EEA, would be a better position to be in, because that would actually allow you full control of your fisheries, but it would also allow you free access to the European single market. It would allow free movement of people and a lot of the benefits without some of the downside.
Yeah, indeed. And I think we've all seen rumours saying that the British government is quite prepared to use Scottish fisheries as a bargaining chip in the Brexit negotiations. So do you think that might finally bring about a change in the fishing industry to make it a little bit more reflective of the yes-no statistics that you see elsewhere?
Yeah, and just on the Christian aspect of things, an awful lot of fishing people have a strong Christian faith. A lot of them don't as well. But along the northeast coast where I come from, you'd find very, very strong religious faith and Christian faith in particular.